Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I've always loved camping. It's been a favorite pastime of mine since childhood. When my wife and I got married, we made a pact to go on a camping trip at least once a year. Last year, our trip took a turn for the worst, and I'll never forget the horrifying experience. We planned a week-long camping trip to an isolated forest, far from the city's fast pace. It was a dense forest, a perfect place to disconnect from the world and spend quality time together. We were excited about the trip and prepared well, packing everything we needed. We reached our destination and set up camp near a small river. It was a picturesque location, with tall trees surrounding us, casting their shadow over the river as it flowed quietly. The first couple of days went smoothly. We enjoyed hiking, fishing, and sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows. On the third day, we noticed something unusual. As we were returning from a hike, we found that some of our supplies had been tampered with. We initially blamed it on the wildlife, but deep down, we sensed that something else was going on. We decided to stay alert and not let it ruin our trip. However, that night, we could feel a change in the atmosphere. The forest, which was usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, had gone eerily silent. We tried to ignore it and went to sleep, but something felt really wrong. The next morning, we woke up to find that our campsite had been ransacked. Our food supplies were strewn all over the place, and our tent had been slashed with what looked like a knife. This was the last straw for us, so we decided to pack up and leave. As we were packing, I spotted something in the distance. I squinted my eyes, trying to make out what it was, but the figure vanished before I could focus. We hurriedly finished packing and started our trek back to the car. The forest, which once felt inviting, now seemed menacing. The silence was deafening, and I felt a constant nagging sensation that we were being followed. We tried to keep our pace steady, but my wife's fear was unmistakable, and I couldn't hide my own nervousness. As the day passed, we discovered more and more signs that we were not alone. A gutted rabbit, still fresh, hung from a tree branch just off the trail. At another point, we found a circle of stones with the remains of a fire in the center, surrounded by what looked like symbols drawn in blood. We pressed on, our resolve weakening with every step. As the sun began to set, I noticed a figure in the distance again. This time, it didn't disappear. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing tattered clothing that hung off his frame. His face was obscured by a hood, and as we continued walking, he seemed to be following us, always staying just out of reach. Panic set in, and we quickened our pace, desperate to reach our car before darkness enveloped us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows lengthening, and our pursuer remaining ever present. Finally, after hours of tense, nerve-wracking travel, we saw our car in the distance. We breathed a sigh of relief and we sprinted the last few yards, tossing our gear into the trunk and starting the engine. As we drove away, I looked back through the rearview mirror. The hooded figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching us, his face still hidden in shadow. I shuddered and tried to forget the dread that gripped me. My wife and I exchanged a silent, terrified glance, knowing that we had just escaped something truly sinister. The drive back to civilization was quiet, the only sound the hum of the car's engine and the occasional choked sob from my wife. We were both trying to process what had just happened, the horror of the experience leaving us numb. When we reached our home, we didn't unpack our camping gear. We just left it in the car, too afraid to relive the memories of that trip. We locked the doors, drew the curtains, and spent the night huddled together in bed, fearful of the darkness that now seemed to hold an unknown terror. When my friends and I decided to go camping in the vast forest near our hometown, we never imagined it would turn into a terrifying ordeal. We were all experienced campers, familiar with the wilderness, and excited about spending a weekend away from the city's chaos. But little did we know that this trip would change our perception of the outdoors forever. We arrived at the forest in the afternoon and set up camp at a clearing surrounded by towering trees. We were miles away from civilization, and the quiet serenity of the forest was a welcome change. The first day was spent hiking, cooking over the campfire, and laughing over memories from our shared past. Night fell, and we slept peacefully under a canopy of stars. The next day, we ventured deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail that seemed to lead to a small lake. As we walked, we noticed the atmosphere of the forest changing. The air grew heavier and a sense of worry settled over us. We brushed off our anxiety, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings and our overactive imaginations. Upon reaching the lake, we discovered an abandoned campsite on the shore. It looked like it had been there for quite some time, with a decaying tent and scattered belongings. Among the belongings were a tattered journal and a broken camera. Intrigued, I pocketed the journal, intending to read it later. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I started flipping through the journal. It belonged to a man who had camped in the same forest years earlier. His entries began, innocently enough, detailing his love for nature and the beauty of the wilderness. But as I continued reading, the tone of the journal took a dark turn. The man described feeling watched, hearing strange noises at night, and finding odd symbols etched into the trees around his campsite. He wrote about a growing sense of paranoia and dread, culminating in a final entry that was little more than frantic scribbles and an unnerving plea for help. My friends and I exchanged nervous glances, our laughter from earlier now replaced by a tense silence. We tried to dismiss the journal as a work of fiction or a prank, but a gnawing feeling of concern continued. Later that night, as we tried to sleep, even though we tried, we weren't able to brush off the unsettling sentiment that had taken hold of us. We could hear what sounded like whispers coming from the woods, the barely audible voices seeming to carry a sinister intent. Our minds raced, remembering the journal's ominous entries, and we found ourselves unable to ignore the disturbing noises. In our tent, we huddled together for comfort and safety, our hearts pounding in our chests. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside the tent caused us to jolt, our imaginations conjuring up horrifying images of malevolent entities lurking just beyond our line of sight. We lay there in the darkness, too afraid to investigate the source of the sounds, and too fearful to even speak. As the night wore on, our minds and bodies were pushed to their limits by fear and adrenaline. Eventually, sheer exhaustion took over, and we drifted into a fitful sleep, our dreams filled with twisted visions of the forest and its unseen horrors. The next morning, we awoke to find our campsite in disarray. Our food supplies had been strewn across the ground, as if tossed by some unseen force. Our camping gear had been moved around, and some items were missing entirely. Most chillingly, we discovered the same strange symbols from the journal carved into the trees surrounding our campsite. The eerie markings appeared to have been made recently, as if to serve as a warning or a message from whatever had been haunting us during the night. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. As we packed up our belongings, we realized that the forest, which had seemed so welcoming when we arrived, now felt oppressive and sinister. I finally made it to the secluded forest for my solo camping trip. It had been a long time since I last had some peace and quiet, and I was more than excited to spend a few days away from the city's constant noise. The campsite I chose was perfect, nestled among the trees and close to a small stream, which added to the serenity of the place. I eagerly set up my tent and looked forward to exploring the area the following day. As the sun set, I cooked dinner and marveled at the beauty of my surroundings. The next day, I spent hours hiking and taking photographs of the picturesque landscapes. I spotted some deer in the distance, and even stumbled upon a family of rabbits playing near the stream. The sights and sounds of nature were rejuvenating, and I felt a sense of freedom and wonder that I hadn't experienced in years. As the day drew to a close, I returned to my campsite, built a campfire, and enjoyed the star-filled sky above me. Exhausted, I eventually crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the soothing sounds of the forest. That night, my peaceful slumber was disrupted by a vivid and terrifying dream. In my dream, I found myself lying in my tent, listening to the rustling leaves outside, when I saw the silhouette of a witch-like figure circling my tent. The figure seemed to glide effortlessly, leaving no trace of her presence. Her laughter sent chills down my spine, and I could sense a sinister energy emanating from her. When I woke up, I felt nauseous and disoriented, as if the dream had been more than just a figment of my imagination. Fear gripped me as I mustered the courage to step out of my tent, only to be horrified by the sight that awaited me. The mutilated carcass of a deer lay just a few feet away, its body torn apart, with deep gashes and blood splattered all around. Panic washed over me as I realized that the gruesome scene outside my tent might be connected to the terrifying dream I had experienced. My heart raced, and I quickly packed up my belongings, desperate to leave the forest as soon as possible. The once serene forest was now a nightmare, and as I hurriedly made my way back to my car, the air seemed to grow thicker with each step I took, and my paranoia increased as I frantically looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the witch-like figure from my dream standing among the trees. The drive home was quiet, but my thoughts were loud and chaotic as I tried to piece together the events of my camping trip. The image of the mutilated deer and the memory of the witch in my dream haunted me, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of unease. I know that there was more to that dream, something that had forever changed my connection to the outdoors. Weeks after the trip, I've been trying to get back to my normal life, but the memories of that horrifying camping trip continue to linger. A once peaceful refuge in nature now feels tainted by the chilling events that transpired in the forest. I find myself waking up in a cold sweat, my dreams filled with the laughter of the witch and the gruesome sight of the deer. I spent hours researching the area where I camped, trying to find any explanation for what I experienced. Some accounts mention a local legend about a witch who once roamed the forest, but nothing concrete has emerged. I started attending therapy to cope with the lingering anxiety from my camping trip. My therapist has encouraged me to share my experience with others in the hope that it might help me process the ordeal and move on. I've joined a support group for people who have experienced unexplained or supernatural encounters, and hearing their stories has provided some solace. I'm not alone in my fear, and that gives me a small measure of comfort. Months after the trip, I'm slowly learning to live with the memories of that horrifying camping trip, but I know that I'll never be the same. The experience has changed my perspective on the world, forcing me to confront the possibility that there are forces beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows. My once cherished pastime of solo camping is now a distant memory, replaced by a profound unease when I even think about venturing into the wilderness alone. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.